I got up with a shock on June 16th when I found out that 20 Indian soldiers had been killed on the border with China. It was the thing I was least expecting for this rivalry to become so hot. On the night of June 15th, for 6 hours, about 600 soldiers from both sides fought with each other at an altitude of over 4,400 meters in the Galwan Valley. The fight started early in the night and continued into early in the morning. Reinforcements were brought up by both sides. Rocks were thrown. Soldiers were thrown off cliffs into the freezing water below. Clubs were used. Clubs wrapped in barbed wire, wrapped in nails. Iron rods were used. It was a frightening sight. Every child imagines that one day he would be in the army. But this shows you the reality of what life in the army can finally be like, what combat can be so bloody. India, according to its own data, lost about 20 soldiers, including one colonel. He was the commandant of the 16th Bihar Regiment, Colonel Santosh Babu. Posthumously, he was awarded the Mahavir Chakra. Now, Chinese on their part claim that they lost 4 soldiers, and each side claims that they lost or had dozens of wounded. 10 Indian soldiers were captured also by China. This was only revealed later when they were released, out of which there were 4 officers and 6 soldiers. So this was a major clash, one could call it even a battle, but without firing of weapons. The reason being that India and China have an agreement, long-standing, that firearms will not be used on the border. This was maintained on that night as well. Even though in subsequent days, Indian soldiers would die of their wounds and of hypothermia in the hospital. Now, why did this situation come about? How did it come about, and what have been the consequences of this have been revealed somewhat by General Naravane's book. General Naravane was the army chief at this point. He wrote a book about 2.5 years ago, and this book has not been cleared by the Ministry of Defense and the government. Clearly, there is some information that they don't want out in the public domain, but Caravan magazine has published some excerpts, and they are quite revealing. And I think it's a sensitive matter, and so I'm speaking with the data, but the Indian public deserves to know because it's a matter of grave national security and also of the lives and well-being of our soldiers. Well, the incidents began already a month prior. That is, in May 2020, there had been a range of confrontations between Indian and Chinese troops all along the border. In Ladakh, various points like Depsang, in Galwan, etc. Then in other points along the long LAC, the line of actual control, as the border with China is known. It's about a 3,400 kilometer long border. And in Sikkim, in Chushul, even in parts of Arunachal, there had been confrontations and lots of people wounded. So what was the reason for that? Well, that's a separate issue I'll come to. But here, Naravane tells us some revealing details. He says that around the second week of May, the Chinese had intruded into our patrolling areas in Galwan and requested that they be allowed to set up tents because it was quite late in the night and they couldn't go back. Later, we would realize that this is actually an excuse. The Indian brigade commanders said, we will discuss with our seniors and get back to you. But the Chinese didn't wait for that. The same night, they set up those tents. Chinese had been setting up tents all across. Over 70 tents they had set up. And they started building more and more infrastructure. They had, a few weeks earlier, objected to India building a road in that Galwan Valley area. Now, Indians thought that these tents will be removed and they kept negotiating, but they realized slowly that Chinese were not going to remove the tents. They kept making one excuse or the other. So around June 15th, Naravane says it, around that time it was decided that Indians will set up 2 tents also in that area. Who gave that order is not clear from the book. But Colonel Santosh Babu, the commandant of that regiment, Bihar Regiment 16th, goes there, he destroys the Chinese tent. There were 2 Chinese tents. And I think this provoked the Chinese. They turned up in larger numbers. Reinforcements were called from the Indian side also. But the Chinese outnumbered the Indians, because our base was about 3.2 kilometers from which the reinforcements were supposed to come, and they couldn't come by motorized vehicles. Whereas the Chinese, infrastructure being better, they could bring in through APCs, armored personnel carriers, and so quickly they could increase their numbers at the point of contact, which is what matters. Prior to that, a few months prior to that, Chinese had already moved 2 divisions on the Ladakh border from the Western Theatre Command. Indians had also been building up forces. Naravane tells us that after this incident, there was another critical point. That is on August 31st, 2020, there was another confrontation. 2 days prior to that, 29th and 30th night, Indian troops had occupied the heights in the Kailash Range. Kailash Range are the hills that overlook Pangong Lake in Ladakh, not very far from the previous incidents. Here, Indians occupied the height, and you know that in the hills and the mountains, whoever occupies the heights has the advantage. So the Indians had the advantage. This might have turned off the Chinese. So they started approaching with 4 tanks and some infantry towards this Kailash Range area. Indians fired an illuminating flare, but this didn't deter the Chinese. And a call came from the Northern Army commander, Lieutenant General Y.K. Joshi, saying that please give us permission, if need be, to open fire. So the Chief of Army Staff Naravane called up the top brass in India. He says he called up General B.K. Joshi, who was at that time the Chief of Army Staff. He called up Ajit Doval, the National Security Advisor. He called up Mr. Jai Shankar, the Foreign Minister. He called up the Defense Minister, Mr. Rajnath Singh. But there was no reply from any of them. The reason he called them up, he says, is orders had been previously given that no fire should be opened without clearance from the topmost authority. So he called up another hour later at around 9:10 again, and again there was no reply. But since he showed the urgency of the matter, because the tanks were still approaching, now they were less than a kilometer away, just a few hundred meters away, he was told they will get back to him. And after discussing with the topmost authority, by around 10, the order came from Defense Minister Rajnath Singh that do as you think appropriate. Now this can't be really called a free hand when you need clearance from the topmost authority for even company level or actions. On the Pakistan border, even major generals have the power, even div commanders have the power to open fire. And certainly lieutenant generals definitely do, corps commanders and army commanders definitely do have the permission. So he says that there was a meeting of the Cabinet Committee on Security in which the army said that, look, we need to be allowed to open fire if need be, because we have lost 20 men in June, and even those men were armed. So if we lose more men, questions will be asked, why were we not allowed to open fire? After much reluctance, it was conveyed that, okay, if the unit is under real serious threat of life, then they can, in the last instance, open fire as a last resort, but only that unit, nobody else in the surrounding area, which makes it very difficult because if you don't have supporting fire. And we in the public were told that, look, there is a free hand and the army can do whatever it feels like. This crucial piece of information and many of the others were never conveyed to us. We were never told that 10 of our soldiers had been captured until they were released. We were never told that clearance has to come from the very top for any kind of opening of fire. There are other revelations about Agniveer, but I'll come to that later. The question is, why did we reach this situation? Why did it come to blows in this manner? So experts have given three major reasons, and of course there is a fourth overarching meta reason. One reason that has been given is, and this is from Chinese think tanks and professors, that China was turned off by the removal of Article 370, which gave Kashmir a special status by the government in 2019, by the Indian government. They felt that this changed the status of Ladakh and of Kashmir without informing them and without consulting with them. And also there was a speech by Home Minister Amit Shah in Parliament which said that we will take back Aksai Chin. These were perceived as aggressive moves. The second, which is more widespread in the West and among Indian experts also, including Tanvi Madan, etc., is that China perceived the closeness between India and US negatively. They felt they were being cornered through various naval exercises in the South China Sea, air and military exercises, and they wanted to push back. The third theory is that during COVID-19, the Chinese leadership had suffered some loss of face and it wanted to regain that. But what really makes sense at the core is what Raja Menon says. That is, the power differential between China and India was growing. China was becoming so much more powerful that at some point it would assert itself. It had already been entering South Asia. You know, in every country of South Asia, you have massive Chinese presence, economically, investment-wise, whether it is Bangladesh, whether it's Nepal. Over 75% of the electric vehicles being sold in Nepal are Chinese. And these electric vehicles are now the majority of new vehicle purchases in Nepal. We know that in Sri Lanka, they're entering in a big way, loans, Hambantota port, etc. In Pakistan, of course, there's the CPEC, there's the whole highways, there's the massive investment in power and industry, in port infrastructure at Gwadar. So China is anyway entering South Asia. And this differential in power ultimately caused this. And we can see that in the sequence of events, which starts actually 1 year before this government. From 2013, we notice that in various areas such as Chushul and in Depsang, etc., confrontations had started. These confrontations and violations kept increasing 2018, 19, 20. And Naravane tells us that there was another problem, which we now know through satellite images as well, that when the disengagement took place, both sides were told to go equidistance from Galwan. The problem was that the Chinese had already intruded first into Galwan. That is, in those areas, India used to patrol before these incidents, but we could not reach those patrolling points any longer. So the buffer zone that was created was largely in the Indian territory. And in fact, intelligence reports say that India lost about 900 square kilometers in Ladakh alone. And if we include the other areas which we lost in this long border from Arunachal to Sikkim to Ladakh, then it would probably definitely go above 1,000 kilometers, square kilometers. So this also, the Prime Minister in fact told us that on June 19th, after this Galwan incident in 2020, that nobody has entered and nobody is sitting on our land or has taken any of our land. This was patently wrong information. We now know, and you can Google it through satellite information, you can get how much area and land we have lost. But this is an indicator of some deeper problems, which I come to now. The third part of this is that we have failed to deter China. Our deterrence has kind of cracked. And this is a more longer term story. That is, we had a big confrontation with China in Doklam in 2017. When Doklam is at that chicken neck of India, that 10 to 20 kilometer broad strip of land which connect mainland India with northeast. On one side is Bangladesh of this chicken neck, on the other side is Bhutan. In 2017, the Doklam incident, right at our chicken neck, that is at that strip of land which is about 10 to 20 kilometers broad, on one side of which lies Bangladesh and the other side lies Bhutan, we had a massive confrontation with China. Why China was getting into that area is so as to threaten that chicken neck. It wants to keep that as a pressure point. So Doklam, which used to largely be Bhutanese territory, has now slowly become Chinese. We pushed up troops and they also pulled in troops in order to continue their infrastructure building. For a while they halted when our troop buildup increased, but later they would continue. Our troops would draw down and they would continue to build their infrastructure. That means they are now in a very threatening position. They have fully fortified bunkers there, they have 5G networks, they have fiber optic cables, they have all kinds of jammers, including satellite jammers and all kinds of air defense and electronic warfare equipment. Part of the reason is that Manoj Joshi says that in 2018, when the Indian government sought a summit at Wuhan in China, it was in order to de-escalate from the 2017 Doklam. That is, the Prime Minister did not want another confrontation or loss of face with China before the 2019 elections. Then we had another point of loss of deterrence. You remember after 2020, we were told we should boycott Chinese products. This is what the government media and all this Godi media was telling us, that we should boycott Chinese products throughout our Chinese TVs, etc., etc. But actually, our trade deficit with China was increasing. China had at that point about an $80 billion or $70 billion trade surplus with us. And now it is $100 billion. And how this happens is that in 2022, the two principals, that is Xi and Modi, meet on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Bali. We were not informed of this. We came to know this 8 months later, when in 2023, August, there was supposed to be a BRICS meeting in South Africa in Johannesburg. A few days or few weeks before that, the Chinese released the information that there had been an understanding between the two sides achieved in Bali the previous year, where we had agreed to de-escalate. We weren't told this, that our Prime Minister had shook hands with the Chinese and come to such an understanding. It was through the Chinese release that we found this out. And then there was a further thaw, as they say, in 2023. And over a period of time, we have now reached the point where we are even willing to allow back Chinese investments. And in a way, Chinese penetration of our economy. It was shown as a masterstroke here, as a masterstroke against America and Trump, because he imposed tariffs on us. But in a way, we have kind of surrendered our deterrence capabilities. See, deterrence is not just about material superiority or material power. It's also about showing the will to resist, the way Afghanistan showed, the way Vietnam showed against the United States. Weaker, but they were willing to fight and die. We haven't shown that. And because we haven't shown that, China has not been deterred. Slowly, over a long period of time, our deterrence has weakened. Now, be that as it may, some people may think, hey, this is realism, why not acknowledge that? The problem is that with a bully, if you don't resist them, they continue to push against you. We have seen the same thing with Trump. Had Trump been a bit pushed against the way China did, he would have learned. And Europe learned this the hard way, as you have seen. That is, Europe kept bending over until the Greenland incident happened, and then they pushed back. And Trump also withdrew. So deterrence is very critical. Now, let's come to the final point of this video. That is, Naravane has some very revealing information also about the Agniveer scheme. The government tells us that it was requested by the army chiefs, but Naravane in his book tells us that no, it was not requested by the three service chief, and specifically the Navy and Air Force were extremely worried and tried to oppose it, because the government's proposal was that they should, incoming soldiers, recruits should serve only 3 years, out of which one goes in training, so basically just 2 years, and then majority of them should be removed, finally leaving only 25% in place and giving them only 20,000 rupees. Because these service chiefs pushed back, the salary was increased to 30,000, and it was decided that okay, they will serve up to 4 years, because the services were insisting at least 5 years. But as a compromise, 4 years was found, which effectively means only 3 years of actual service training, service, because 1 year goes in the Navy and Air Force in training, because the equipment is very specialized, fighter aircrafts, radars, sonars, etc. You need to train the soldiers. So, and the second incident associated with Naravane is that Naravane was the Delhi area commander when he was a major general in 2017. There was an incident in 2016. On 15th August, every year, the Delhi area commander accompanies the Prime Minister to the ramparts of the Red Fort and stands behind him throughout the speech and then accompanies him back down. But the Delhi area commander in 2016 was told that you can accompany the Prime Minister, but when you have to stand, don't stand in the frame, stand outside. This is very insulting for an army commander. And then you can accompany the Prime Minister back down. He had to comply. But the next year, the army decided that we will keep with the tradition of the Major General standing behind the Prime Minister during the speech. But there was a severe pushback from the SPG and from the PMO. And a compromise was found where Bipin Rawat, who was the Chief of Army Staff that time, and quite compliant both with the government but also with the BJP's party line, he told that we should comply with the PMO's orders. And so Naravane went up, but he didn't stand outside the frame. He came back down and sat next to the army chief. And then he went back up when the Prime Minister had finished his speech and accompanied him down. This was clearly noticed by the powers that be. And people say that this was one of the reasons that this soldier, who always took care of his soldiers' welfare, was not promoted to Chief of Defence Staff after he finished his tenure as Chief of Army Staff. That is, he was not given the topmost security post. A new circular was issued which said that now the Chief of Defence Staff doesn't have to be a former service chief. Even Lieutenant Generals are now eligible. And that's how General Chauhan was appointed as Chief of Defence Staff. So these details are revealing not just about India's security, but also about the nature of the government, its behavior, and the politicization of the army, principally through the former Chief of Defence Staff, who's now deceased, General Joshi. That is, if you comply with the government's demands, if you're subservient, then you will get the position. You won't get it necessarily on merit. And this is very disturbing, because one area where you definitely need the best person, not just in competence, but also in character, is in the defense forces at the top, because that is where our security really matters, our survival matters. Well, be that as it may, I'll keep bringing such insights to you because they are critical for us. So keep paying attention and subscribe and like my channel. And I will continue with my duty. Please do yours.